All right, so we're now recording.
Egad.
I know, it's shocking, right? So look good and speak well for posterity's sake and all that good stuff. But I suppose I'm figuring this as the first in maybe a series of, I guess it's technically a podcast, but it feels weird calling it that. But essentially, you could call it a bunch of conversations with people about the things that I think that first year's writers need to hear that they often don't. Or, maybe answers to the questions that first year students don't know how to ask in some sense. It's not going to be particularly skills focused unless it happens to be. At least that's not what I'm imagining. But you could call it sort of talks about sort of a philosophy of writing, about more nuanced takes on what writing is and how it works in some sense. And it'll be, as most things are, a kind of rough thing at the start, and then as we go, it'll get better, and that'll probably be true over the course of this conversation, and also true over the course of the series. But
are you saying that I'm going to be rough at the beginning?
Yeah, there's a reason you're my first one.
That I'm crude, crass, even vulgar?
Yeah, no. No, but great, you threw me off the train of thought.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, that's actually not fucking the truth. But the reason I wanted to make this sort of thing was because I found that there is a surprisingly large number of students who find these sorts of conversations about what, again, just broadly speaking, what writing is and how it works to be more useful than they would expect, and even sometimes legitimately interesting. I think in some general sense, it is really worth knowing why you're doing the things that you're doing, and maybe hearing some different takes on why you're doing the things that you're doing, and maybe thinking about, well, what that means for how you go about doing the things that you are doing. And I may make my own little intro video that'll stand apart from these things at some point to kind of give an example of what I'm thinking about with that, so that it's easier to get into the gist and the spirit of what we're doing when we're watching these. But that's kind of the impetus for this series of conversations. It's also so you can see Zach's cute dog in the background. Kind of looks like she wants to leave.
No, that's my closet door. She thinks there's a treat on top of the doorknob.
Is there?
No, but sometimes there is.
Okay. Also, bad jokes. That's part of what we're here for too.
That wasn't a joke. That's serious.
Okay then. But yeah, so I have with me here Zach Brett, former Hamilton classmate, someone I have learned from, both in terms of more called expository writing, creative writing. He's a really brilliant guy, and I'm saying that because I know you never will. But I really wanted to start, Zach, with you as the sort of, the starting thing, because first it was our conversation the other day that kind of made this pop into my head when we were talking about research and sort of the research process. But, I also figured that you and I have worked in various different writing situations together, or at least we've kind of traded writing a lot, and I think that as a general conversation, ours might be a good starting point, because I've got a whole list of other people that I'm thinking about talking to about this, that, or the other, but I thought that you and I might be able to have it would be a good discussion to start the series with, or at least to see what kind of things we can go with. So, I have, again, a few more specific things that I was thinking about, especially with research. And you were a history major, so the difference between history research and English research, and what we might be able to tease out of that. But I think I want to start just with the most general possible question, which is, to to your mind, what kinds of things do you think a first year writer needs to hear that they might not hear in their, run of the mill first year writing class?
I mean, there are a lot of them. The first one that pops into my head, and that always pops into my head these days because I've been thinking about it a lot, is that writing isn't just communication qua communication. It's not about telling someone what you think. It's really almost like a framework for simulating thought.
Oh,
And so, like, what I struggled with a lot in school, and what I feel like I've only come to realize recently, is that when you're writing, you're not just making a series of points. What you're really doing, and I think actually I learned a lot of this from you with the way you give notes. When you're writing, it's a process, and when you're reading, it's a process, and you're trying as narrowly as possible to simulate the thoughts you want your reader to have. If you don't do that, you're going to end up with holes in your reasoning, holes in your argument, and you're going to end up with all kinds of issues that you wouldn't have if you thought as narrowly as possible. So my advice to a first year would be go narrow, like as narrow as you possibly can in your reasoning, even on a sentence by sentence structure, because that is going to give you really good insight into whether you're making your case.
So can you talk a little, because I think I have a general sense of what you mean by narrow, but I want to make sure. When you say narrow, what do you mean?
I mean, I've been doing a lot of programming recently, and the way I've been thinking about it is it's not all that different from writing, where instead of, like, when you're programming, let's say you have a series of commands you're giving to the computer because you want it to do everything in between, and the computer is too stupid to jump to conclusions about what you want. People aren't really all that different from the computer when they're reading. You don't want to leave them with any room to think, oh, I wonder if they mean this or that. You kind of want to be deliberate in the train of your reasoning and in the train of your argument. In a way, you're programming the response you want in the reader. Obviously, people can think for themselves and they can draw conclusions from all of that. But in terms of your meaning, you want them as narrowly focused on each specific step in your reasoning as possible, which is something they teach about, but they don't really, how do I put this? They don't teach it on a microcosm level, I find.
You mean like at the level of the sentence?
Level of the sentence up to the level of the paragraph, everything is like, I mean, the way I thought about it in college was, you gave me notes that, like, I joked that it was like, oh, I feel hungry when I'm reading this sentence, or things like that. But it was basically like you were talking about how you were feeling when you were reading a specific sentence,
Yeah.
because it triggers a kind of thought in your head.
Yeah.
And what I found when writing was that I kind of assumed that people could follow my train of logic when I started out. And that's the thing that I found the hardest when I was in school, was this idea that not every step in your reasoning is going to be clear to everyone the way it would be to you. And you often have to go much more explicit, much more nitty-gritty than you would expect.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I've not. I mean, the problem you're outlining, others, and I think I myself would describe it as, it's your first year students when they come in, there's a sort of, they don't seem to realize all the time that what they mean and what their language actually says may not be one and the same thing.
Exactly.
And I have, I think, tried to address that problem indirectly, just in the way that I've tried to teach things, insofar as, I mean, my general step for getting a student to be more clear is to get them to stop thinking in terms of language and just start trying to think in terms of ideas and say, look, what are you trying to tell me? And usually they will.
Right.
And if you just ask them, like, what do you mean? They can usually tell you, as long as they're not caught up in that mindset of trying to speak academically or, in academies or whatever.
Right.
I actually had I had a joke with my students the other day where I told them a few weeks ago that if any of them turned in an essay with like the word plethora or, you know, utilize or some other thing that was there just to sound fancy, that I was going to print out that essay just so I could throw it away. And then someone used plethora. So over Zoom, I said, okay, this is an essay printed out. And you all thought I was kidding.
Should have burned it.
Okay. Obviously, it was like, and no, like obviously I didn't grade the person down. But
Right,
okay, that's off track. Because what I'm trying to get at is that I've never tried to, I don't have a good way of addressing the, call it the problem of imprecise language, maybe. I've never found a good way to address that directly at the language level, where you look at the sentence you've written and then you try to change that sentence while you're looking at it on the page. I can do that. I have no idea how I learned to do that beyond
Practice.
just brute practice, right?
Well,
And
I mean,
yeah.
oh, please go on.
No, please.
Well, I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot actually is that sentences, I mean, this ties back in. Sentences are formal logic. You know, you have components that tie together, and then those components build up into your overall argument. But at the end of the day, every thought that you're putting into your argument has to be consistent with its own formal logic. And that's the problem with academic writing that I find people have trouble with. You know, they don't, I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at, is when it's in your head, the reasoning is mushy, but it's there.
Right.
And your job is to tease it out into this kind of formal reasoning, which, you know, it's almost mathematical. Like, I don't know how else to put it.
No, I think you're getting at, so I actually gave a talk, I think, about this from another angle, or using a different sort of metaphor we were talking about to my students the other day, where I explained to them, look, basically what you're doing when you're writing an essay is you're reaching up into that sort of foggy area on the edge of your thoughts where everything kind of registers as a feeling or a flashing impulse of some kind. And you're grabbing a chunk of that cloud and you're dragging it back down into your sort of front and center articulated space of thought or whatever.
Right.
Working memory, perhaps. I don't know what the psychological term would be, but and then you're basically hammering that out into a usable shape. And then the question is, okay, well, what shape is that? Like, what does a solidified idea look like? And it seems to me that it looks like words. That's what's happening. That feeling of trying to struggle with that grand and strange and changing idea, that's the struggle of trying to put something into words. And that's the basic action of essay writing.
Right.
And is that kind of what you're getting at, or at least another angle of it?
I think it's a more succinct and colorful way of putting the same thing. It's a better description thereof. I mean, at the end of the day, all I really mean is that when you're writing, there's this sense that you're trying to communicate, but you have to be aware that the best thing you can possibly do for yourself and for your reader is in some ways to pretend that your reader is stupid, that your reader is overly literal, and that they don't know what you're talking about. And if you view it from that lens, if you take that empathetic step of saying, assuming a kindergartner had the vocabulary and the assumed knowledge to understand this, what would a kindergartner say of my sentence?
Right.
Basically, you want someone who is uneducated, who is not coming at this from your perspective, to be able to understand you, as long as they have the general background that you expect your audience to have. Because obviously, if you're talking about astrophysics, you're not expect a kindergartner to understand that. But ideally, you could write in such a way that you could explain those concepts.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually, I need to get myself a copy of this book, but when I was at UVA, I was doing the thesis research, and one of the books I came across was it was Jerome Bruner's, I think it was The Process of Education. It's like 1962. It's an old book, but it's short, and I bring it up for two reasons. First, because it demonstrates just in its own writing the kind of thing you're talking about, where it takes incredibly complex ideas and says them very, very simply, right? In a way that anyone can. So you hesitate.
No, I just had a thought, and I'm holding it until you're done.
Okay, so then the other thing I wanted to bring up was that one of the things, if I'm remembering this correctly, was that one of the things that Jerome Bruner was kind of known for saying and believing, and I'm this, it's going to be halfway a quote and halfway a bad botching of the quote, but the idea he said is that, look, you can teach anything to anyone. Like theoretically, it is possible to convey any idea in a form that is simple enough without actually distorting the idea, like without oversimplifying it. It's possible to take an idea and teach it to anyone. And, you know, my take on that in my own teaching has been, I think that he's right. Theoretically, that doesn't mean that you're going to have the time and the resources to actually make good on that for everyone. But I would tell you this, that I have seen, and this is where you'll be able to tell that I'm kind of off in my own little la la land a little bit, but I don't actually think that. I've seen the same sort of spark of attention in the eyes of some of the most brilliant grad student classmates I've had, as in the most underperforming ninth grade students at the Title I school that I taught at. I mean, I'm talking about kids who have registered or about one or two kids in particular, I think they had a registered IQ of 60. Like 60. That if you're not familiar with, I'm saying this.
Not at all.
Well, I will. Here's one thing that might be worth knowing then, and this is, I guess, for you and also the audience. An IQ of 80 is the technical cutoff for mental retardation.
Oh boy.
Yeah. Now, it's, it's, I would wonder whether the kid just couldn't quite, manage the test in some sense, whether it was more of a testing problem. But I will tell you this, he was, and this is not a knock against him, because I think that equating intelligence with dignity or value is a moral flaw.
But, I mean, there are also, just on a total side note, there are serious problems with the measure of IQ in general. Like,
okay,
I've met some people who are ranked very highly on IQ who, can't toast bread, and some people who are ranked rather lowly who are quite street smart, I would say.
Right.
But,
right. And yes, I'm not, I'm perhaps as familiar with, I guess it's not a literary one, but my point is that if I had enough time and resources, and I had the kid that I'm thinking about, I could teach that kid anything.
Yeah.
Because it's like, what do you do with a kid like that? It's like, well, you figure it out. Because I've seen him, I watched his eyes when he was finally getting something, and that same like happy attention, like he was focused. He wasn't glazed over. He was focused in the same way that, like, God, one of my, talking with you, when you're focused, you've got that, like, the lights on upstairs. So something Jerome Bruner, something. I can't remember where exactly we got off that, but people can rewind and check. But,
I mean, I think I get where you're driving at, because ultimately education, and not just education, but learning, which I think is more important than education as a term, is a muscle. Like,
yeah.
Your entire brain's wiring, we forget, is constantly redoing itself. And so even if you're not in the habit of learning something a specific way, or, of learning a specific subject, you push yourself enough and you will learn it. When you mentioned Jerome Bruner, I think you said,
yeah,
the thing that popped into my head was Charles Darwin. I don't remember. Did you read him when you took classics of modern social thought?
I did, but it was first year. So it was a while ago, but I kind of, what were you getting at?
Give Darwin another read, because frankly, it's one of the most complicated subjects that I'm aware of, at least for me, because I'm not up to date on science at all. But the man's writing is exactly what you're talking about. Totally unpretentious, very to the point, and he has this habit of kind of building up the blocks. Frankly, I think he might be my favorite writer. And I don't even like the subject, because he begins the thing saying, I'm not as smart as some people. I don't have the intelligence of some, but I have kind of a plodding curiosity that I like to, drive towards these observations. And as he writes, he kind of makes good on that same promise, where every sentence, like, there's nothing elaborate about it. There's nothing, you know, aesthetically, I don't want to say pleasing, but ornate, I should say, about his writing. But as he writes, he kind of builds together this argument that's incredibly compelling, and there's a kind of affability to it that's just really, really interesting.
Well, I remember when you were reading Darwin. I remember just sitting around the common room with you doing my own work, and you would like record like, he's right.
There's that too.
On his observations more than his writing style, but you would just sit around and say like, I can't believe it. He's just looking at stuff and thinking about it, and he's right.
Yep. How did he know?
It's like, there you go. But you talking about that makes me think about I don't know if you've ever read any C.S. Lewis beyond like Narnia.
I haven't even read Narnia.
So I mean, first of all, read Narnia because it's Narnia. But I'm sure you have other things to do. But now, I don't know if I guess this is a recommendation for both you and whoever's listening to this. But Mere Christianity is one of the best written books I've ever read. Like putting this, like obviously I'm Presbyterian, you're Jewish, so the theology might not line up a bit, but it is. I have an incredible, like I was saying earlier, I have an incredible amount of respect for people who can take incredibly complex ideas and say them very plainly. And that is Lewis to a T. It's not pretentious. It's very much, you can read that. Like I'm talking to like anyone who's listening. It's like, you can read Lewis and he will present you with some very complicated ideas, and he will do it in a way that is neither condescending nor, as you might put it, ornate. And it's just something really beautiful about that, and also useful. So interesting. So I don't know, did you have anything else you wanted to say about that, or I might ask you another question?
Go for it.
So moving into the research angle of things, because I think there's a lot more overlap between the process of writing and the process of research, just in terms of what happens in your head and the basic sort of working out of information that you're doing. I think there's a lot more common between research and just writing a non-research paper than a lot of first-year students, or frankly students of any year, realize. Because it's, and this would be sort of my called a hypothesis, and then you can tell me what you think of it. It seems to me that in some basic sense, what you're doing when you're writing any sort of paper is you're gathering information and then putting it into some shape of, in the shape that forms an argument, right? And in the case of a non-research paper, the information you're sourcing is from within your own head. It's like long-term memory or something. And then when you're writing a research paper, you're still sourcing information. It just happens to be out there in the world. And that means that the method of acquiring the information is different. You're not just sitting around and writing and thinking. You actually have to go search for things. But at the end of the day, it's all just information. And some of it's going to be credible, and some of it's not going to be credible. And some of it's going to be relevant and useful, and some of it's not going to be relevant and useful. And that holds true for both things that are up inside your head and the things that aren't. And I think I offer that as sort of an answer to students' concerns about how to use research and how to use the sources that they find, because it seems to me that you just use any other kind of information. So I don't know, what do you think of that? Where am I wrong?
You're not wrong at all. Like,
what do I have you here
the
for?
short answer is yes. I mean, look at fiction writers. Like, I know you're not a fan of him, but I like A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin.
Oh, it's
that guy, before he starts writing, like, he talks about it. He goes and he reads like dozens and dozens of books on everything from medieval castle building to, this is how they cooked, this is how armor worked, like, it's there's really no difference in the process between whether you're getting the information from your life, from a book, whether you're applying it to fiction writing, to history writing, English writing. It's like you said, it's all just information. You have to consume the information, process it in a way that lets you remember it and refer back to it, especially in academic writing, where the biggest challenge I find is not getting the information, but actually just remembering where you got it.
Yeah.
But I mean, frankly, I think the processing of the information is harder than the fact that, yeah, it's all basically research is not, in a way, it's kind of a stupid term because it's basically just learning for yourself with the intent to teach others.
I like that you point out with the intent to teach others, because I think that's, I mean, because I think the one problem you identified in there was that, you gotta sort out where you got your information from, because obviously that's important for citation purposes, for, avoiding plagiarism, and also for, I mean, the other reason you have citations is to point people in the direction of further reading if they're interested in that, so that, a reader can track the conversation that's been had. But
right.
The other, when you bring up with the intent to teach someone else's information, I think, well, the thing that I'm using that as a segue into is the idea that the other thing you need to keep track of is the reason that you are bringing X or Y piece of research in. My students are writing their annotated bibliographies this upcoming week.
Poor lambs.
Yeah, right. But one of the things I've made sure, and they've kind of done it in stages, where they said, okay, gather these sources, okay, then do like this part of a research journal, and now do this part of a research journal, now turn it into an annotated bibliography. And I sort of elided the fact that, yeah, I'm kind of using two terms for the same thing when I talk about research journal and annotated bibliography. But the one thing I've made sure they've been doing, and I've really harped on them with this, is that when you get the information that tells you what, like the citation information for the source, write that down, and then write a decent explanation of why this source is going in your paper, so that you keep track of that information too. Because as I explained to them, like, look, the citation information is why you're allowed to put this source in your paper. But the explanation that you're writing is why it's going in is why you want it in your paper. Yep. So you'd be allowed to take any source from the world and put it into your paper, provided that you got the citation information for it. But that doesn't mean that every source in the world is one you want in there. So make sure that you know what you're doing with the information. And that's, again, keeping track of that reasoning, the logic that we were talking about earlier, so that you know how things fit together. And this is more on a macro level, like from paragraph to paragraph or section to section. Yeah, there's a reason why your writing teachers make you write annotated bibliographies.
Absolutely. It's not fun, especially the first time you do it, but it's actually a very good exercise. One thing that made me think of actually was the way Crafty wrote papers, which is...
Oh, I want to have him one of them when you talk about that, actually.
I mean, what I want to say about it is that even though I wouldn't recommend writing a paper that way, there's actually a really good lesson to be learned from the fact that he was so successful at doing that. Basically, what he would do is he would start out with his thesis. He basically had a hunch, and that's all a thesis is, this is the thing I want to prove. This is the thing that I think about this. And then he'd start writing his paper, and he'd go back in as he's going and say, okay, here's a source that can prove my point. The problem with working that way is that you end up with holes in your argument if you look too closely. But the thing that's useful about it is that it proves the point of targeted research, where you're basically taking the information that you're gathering and you're applying it for a purpose. Like, nothing you're gathering is there simply to be there. It's there because, you're trying to convince someone of something. And ultimately, that's the entire purpose of writing your paper. That's the entire purpose of all of your research.
Yeah. If you weren't doing that, why are you writing the paper?
Exactly.
It kind of goes back to what I'm not sure if I've ever run this one by you, but the way I talk about like a thesis statement or theses, plural of thesis, or
Thesi.
Don't confuse them more than they already are.
Thesay.
Stop it. The
Go with
way
Old
I
English,
talk,
Thesis.
oh boy,
All right, I'm done.
are you?
I don't know, but let's move on, and maybe I will be.
Oh boy. But the thing I talk about, the way I explain, like, because everyone asks, like, what makes a strong thesis statement, and the way I explain is like, look, your thesis statement is strong enough when it needs a paper after it in order to be proven. Because if it didn't, then why are you writing one?
I mean, the caveat to that is, I mean, it's absolutely true, but the caveat that I think is important to mention is, and when you can prove it with a paper.
Yes, that's also true.
Because I find actually often that when I'm editing someone's paper, like a lot of people when they're starting out, they'll be like, and here's this giant point that I want to prove with my 3-page paper.
Yeah.
And you're like,
Yeah.
narrow it, please, for your own sake.
For your sake and mine.
That too.
Yeah, but that, I mean, that's very true. And that's kind of the other thing that you got to hammer into people, into the student. I mean, attention first year students who may have thrown this out while doing something else. This is something you should listen to. Be willing to change your thesis. It is really, I think, better to think of it as a hypothesis when you start out. I mean, you know, it's more interesting when you get to the end of a paper if you've actually had to change it.
Because, I mean, one of my,
go on. No, please.
I still remember this one paper that I wrote for Milton, actually, where I get halfway through and I'm like, I'm wrong. And it was one of the best feelings because suddenly I realized that what Milton was doing in the paper, in his, I think it was Samson Agonistes, what he was doing was just so much cooler than I realized.
But, right. And then you talk about that, and it's like, and it seems to me that people, when they hit that point, they panic, right? They panic for a few reasons, but one of the reasons that they panic is that they think, oh no, I have to rewrite everything. And it's like, maybe you might have to rewrite large chunks, but here's something to think about too. All of what you've written so far led you to think the thing you're now thinking, led you to this realization. So in other words, moving through that information is what brought you to that point. Well, isn't that what evidence is? Isn't that what proof is? Now, maybe it's not to say you're not going to have to change anything because you framed that information in a certain way. You've said, I'm presenting you with this information in order to prove X. But now you're trying to prove Y. Well, it turns out that the information you already used for X actually does lead you to Y. So now all you have to go back up and do is change like the edges of your paragraphs usually, or any place where you said this proves X and change it so you're pointing out that it actually proves Y. That's not going to be true all the time. Not by any means. It's not that simple, but changing your thesis is less devastating to the stuff you've already written than I think a lot of people usually think.
Well, I mean, there's also the factor of even if you have to write the whole thing, even if you have to scrap it, you now have an understanding for, and if you've really like come to a change of opinion, hopefully a passion for your topic that you didn't have when you started out. Because often when you're starting out to write a paper, it's because, no offense, but it's because some prof like you said, and now you have to write a paper on X. And you're like, oh, really? Do I have to?
Yeah. You're
and
right.
Then when you change your opinion, suddenly you have this understanding and this feeling of, oh, I actually have something to say about this, which I find will make it go much, much faster. I mean, but one thing I think all of that ignores, though, is that in order to change your thesis, you also have to be willing to change your opinion. And that's often harder for many people starting out than actually, and frankly, continuing on, than actually redoing the work. Because it's hard to, admit to yourself that you were wrong. I don't know. That's my take on it. But
that's very interesting.
Like it takes a certain amount of humility, I guess.
Yeah, because you're right. Like in a general, like take it outside of writing. Obviously, people have trouble admitting when they're wrong. And what you bring, it makes me wonder. So does that suppose that a student has, or the typical student has, a connection to the idea that goes beyond just I need to write a paper?
I guess it does presuppose. I mean, there are definitely the cases where you just need to write the paper, and definitely cases where you're like, I'm invested in this idea. And sometimes they overlap where you start out saying, I just need to write the paper, but as you go, you become invested in it. You're like, this is just the fact. And there's also the extra factor, not to layer too much on it, but sometimes people write papers thinking, my professor thinks this, I need to mirror that,
Yeah.
which
Oh, yeah.
is very dangerous in terms of writing, because it means that you don't really mean what you're saying.
Yeah.
And if you don't mean what you're saying, how can you expect to convince anyone else that's what you mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a whole thing. I mean, I tell my students from the first day that, they are never to tell me, I don't ever want, what do I tell them? I tell them, I don't ever want you to write me an essay that tells me what you think I want to hear, because what I want to hear is what you actually think. And then I remind them constantly throughout the semester that I told them that. And they probably get sick of hearing it, but they remember it. And then they have to actually practice that, because you can hear that and go, oh, that's so great, but then like when you sit down to write, you're going to snap right back into your old habits. So it's not like having the epiphany suddenly fix the problem, but it's a step, and then you make a concerted effort to actually act as if that's true. But that's a very interesting take, because I think you may be right. Not that, like, if you ask the student, do you have an emotional investment or some sort of attachment to this idea outside, they say if you were another student asking, because if you're the professor asking, they're going to tell you, oh, of course I care about this. But if you're another student asking, they're probably going to tell you, it's a paper. But I don't know that that's true. And I have not thought about this before. I don't know if that's true, because, well, it is difficult to admit that you're wrong. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, frankly, it's not even about having a conscious emotional attachment. You do anything for any serious amount of time, you put any serious amount of energy into anything, and you're going to become invested. Like, you could be shining your shoes, for crying out loud, and be like, this has to be perfect. Sooner or later, though, you have to admit that it's basically like the way you're doing something isn't necessarily the right way to do it. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it doesn't matter whether you're, I don't know, I can't find my words right now, but it doesn't matter whether you're like just investing energy into digging a hole or into writing a paper. Sooner or later, you are going to develop that emotional attachment into the task at hand.
Yeah. Which is a good thing too, right? Because it actually, because, like, good Lord, think about it, if you never got attached to anything that you did, life would be hell. I mean, it really would. Like, you wouldn't be able to get involved in anything. So,
right.
It's not like it's a bad thing necessarily, but it can be.
Well, it's just something to be aware of, honestly, because sometimes it works with you and sometimes it works against you.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same reason that people get prickly about their writing. They're like, these are my words. How can they be bad?
Yeah.
These are my ideas. Like, and it's ultimately, it's nothing about you. It's just how you framed that thought, or sometimes the thought is wrong.
Right.
And, it takes a certain amount of humility and, comfort with yourself to say, no, I was wrong in this.
Right. I mean, if nothing else, it requires realizing that you're not your thoughts. Those, like, your thoughts and yourself are not the same thing. And you can tell this because you can think about your thoughts. You can put them out on the table of your mind and examine them, and they're not you.
I don't know. My head's about to explode from the paradox.
I don't think it's a paradox, though, because all it says is, like, you put the thought out, and it's like, okay, fine, you're nodding like you're.
I was making a joke.
How much you're effing with me right now.
I was just thinking about, like, I don't know, Futurama and all of the various things where you tell the robot some kind of thing that, are you your thoughts? It causes its head to explode. Like, I don't know. It was stupid. Don't think about it.
Yes. Don't think about it too much. Okay. But he's putting in metacognition away for a bit then, I suppose.
Also, don't think about a pink elephant.
I'm just immediately thinking about how many people watch this that you have now caused to think about a pink elephant. So congrats.
I mean, let's face it, 2.
I don't know. I think it'll be. I don't know. It'll depend.
No, I mean, hopefully, people will actually draw value from everything other than my stupid jokes.
Especially your stupid jokes. That's what we're really here for. Everything else is filler.
Anyway.
So I did want to get on to. I don't know what'll come of this question or this conversation, but that's kind of why I want to ask it. History and English. So a little bit of background, people. Zach was a history major. I was a creative writing major, but that was basically an English major, and then you took creative writing workshops on the side. And Zach and I have both written in the same class English research papers. And I think I've written history papers, although it's difficult to call them research papers in the particular classes that I was with you in. But, what do you think are the differences there between doing research and maybe writing history versus English? And yeah, I mean, that's the question.
I mean, on a macro level, absolutely none. On a micro level, there are some important differences. Just frankly, from an academic level, like if you're going into a history major, the kinds of papers you're going to run into, not just in terms of topic, are very different than the kinds of English papers you run into. Admittedly, that's at Hamilton, so maybe things are different elsewhere, but I found that papers for history tended to be much shorter, much longer, but less in between than English ones tended to be. I guess all of that's neither here nor there. The real approach difference in research would come down to, in history, it's narrower. I mean, you have a limited number of things you can draw on and a limited number of points you can make. In English, your opinion and your feelings hold up much more. And so how you feel about a topic is relevant because it's, ultimately all writing in an English context is meant to make you feel something.
Right.
And so how you feel is genuinely relevant. Whereas when you're studying in history, I mean, depending on who you talk to, but from my perspective, at least, your feelings should be acknowledged as a source of bias rather than as a source of knowledge. And so you'll be looking at a much narrower range of sources for information. And you'll be sort of, rather than in dialogue with yourself, you'll be almost in a courtroom type setting with yourself, where you're sitting there thinking, what do I think about this? And why do I think it? And how is that infecting my research? And I think that's a very important distinction. In terms of the actual writing, I mean, there are some stylistic differences, but I never found that they caused problems one way or the other. You could go either way, whether you were going in terms of like going from narrow thoughts to big thoughts or big thoughts to narrow thoughts. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling, so stop me, please.
I don't think you are. Or if you are, then it's productive rambling. But so here's another way I want to ask the question. It's not because the answer you just gave was insufficient or anything. It's just because while you were talking, I thought of another way to frame it. So coming back to the idea of like giving advice to first years, or I guess in this case, maybe giving advice to people who are about to go into an English major or a history major. Like, would the advice, let's say a first year student comes up to you and says, hey, Zach, I want to become a history major. And then another student comes up and says, hey, Zach, I want to be an English major. What would you give those two students slightly different advice? I mean, there'll probably be a lot of the same advice you would give them, which is kind of what we talked about at the beginning. But what would you tell them that might be different from one another?
So there's one thing I would tell them that would be the same, and then that brings us into things that would be different. One is sooner or later you will encounter something called postmodernism.
Oh no!
Um, and,
The
well,
first episode it came up.
it had to.
Uh,
The general idea, and I'll admit I'm not an expert, but you're going to encounter it sooner or later. It's this idea that knowledge is human constructed and therefore fictitious in some sense. And you can correct me at any point if I'm wrong, because again, this is not my field of expertise. But there is some kernel of truth in that, but it's also a very dangerous thought for academic purposes. And the kernel of truth is that fundamentally we are all human beings. We all understand things from our own perspectives, and the sources you're encountering, whether you're a history major, an English major, anything, even if you're in the sciences, frankly,
Yeah.
are fundamentally subjective. There will be objective kernels in there, but they are subjective. They're written by a human being and from a human point of view. And so you can't take them at face value, and there are going to be multiple interpretations that are valid. However, whatever you're studying, if you take it too far down that road of thinking like everything is subjective, then sooner or later there's a temptation to believe that any argument you make is also valid. And that itself, I think, has obvious dangers to it. The differences would come in when you're looking at a history major. I would say pay special emphasis to the facts and then spend time interrogating yourself about how you are interpreting the facts. I would reverse that with an English major and say, think about how you feel about this and then dig into the source and figure out why you feel that way. And it's probably perfectly obvious, but it's almost like the same approach in reverse. One, you start with hard data and you turn it into something subjective, and in the other, you start with something subjective and you turn it into hard data.
It's very interesting.
I mean,
So,
I could be totally off.
Yeah, the one thing I'll mention just to postmodernism, and it's worth, again, I'm saying this for the listeners here. It should be perfectly obvious what Zach and I think of postmodernism, and therefore you should find someone else who actually A, probably knows more about it, but B, also could give it, its own fair trial, right? I mean,
This is fair.
Well, again, I would say this. I think we're right about it.
But you would say that.
Exactly. That's the point that postmodernism has that you pointed out. It's like, well, okay, that's my take. But what I would say briefly about it is that the problem of it comes in when you say, okay, well, it's fundamentally true that nothing is fundamentally true. And if you pay attention to that for half of a second, you realize that statement cannot possibly be true. It can be false, but it can't be true, which is why, to my mind, that's not to say that people don't have biases and that everything you read from everyone ever is going to be, in some sense, touched by bias. That's absolutely true. But where I think the postmodernist idea takes it too far is to say, well, that means that there actually isn't anything fundamentally true. It's like, well, does that include your idea? Because if so, then we're back to square one, because your idea just ate itself, like an Ouroboros snake. But that's maybe a conversation to have another time.
This is perfectly fair.
The data point that you made, I like the fact that you use data, because I've talked about it in terms of data before. So here's maybe an interesting little story based on that. So I once had in the writing center a third-year econ student who was taking her first poetry class. And she was very much left-brain, very much hard data-driven, very much an econ student. And she was also clearly very bright. I mean, she wasn't stupid. But what she was doing was the thing that a lot of people from the sciences, or a lot of just first year writers try to do when they encounter like analyzing a poem, is they kind of set their thesis and then they draw the information. They try to like beat it into shape, into line behind the thesis, you know, and try to prove their point. They have to twist. It's twisted in like almost every sense, in the sense that like the logic is obviously twisted, the words are almost getting twisted in the page, and I mean this not as almost not as a joke. Like physiologically, they kind of curl up on themselves because it's a chaotic thing and they don't know what to do, so they're kind of like they're screwing up about it, right? So it's like the whole thing from mind to paper is all like twisted in some sense, because they're trying to bend all this information into a thesis that they've already set out. And what I told this, because this is what was happening with her, what I told her was, look, you're an econ student, right? So when you get a bunch of data in front of you, are you like trying to, you know, beat that data into the shape of the thing you're trying to, you know, prove? Or are you looking at the data and letting it tell you what it tells you? And she said, well, let it tell you what it tells you. Say, so, okay, cool. These quotes that you pulled out, that's your data set. What do they tell you? And she said, oh, I guess it tells me da 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 da. And I said, well, that's a great thesis. Write that down. And she went, oh, and she wrote that down. And she was really. And when I say that, like, I think it's worth noting that that doesn't just make the paper better. It makes you as a writer feel better, because just as the writing comes untwisted, like that changed all the way back up, even into your body posture. And there's some, I don't know exactly what to make of that, but it's a more profound thing than I think people realize, to let the ideas kind of lead you where they're actually leading you.
Mm-hmm.
Makes things a lot, I don't know, makes things less unpleasant. But that's an interesting way of thinking about it on history versus English. Was it feelings into data versus data into?
Well, I mean,
yeah, you said
your purpose is reversed. So like in history, you're trying to show something about what happened and why it happened. And then your feelings on all of that information are going to inform your opinion on it. And you should acknowledge that, and you should acknowledge other people's feelings on that. But ultimately, you're taking the facts and then you're letting them tell you something about concrete events. In English, you're trying to make a point about how you feel about something, like, or how people should feel, or how, you know, people generally do feel about something based on how it's constructed. And so when you're working historically, you have to take those facts and synthesize them into something approaching a feeling, whereas in English, you're reverse engineering it in a way. You're taking the feeling that you have or that you've noticed other people have, and you're, you know, turning it back into, you know, what creates this.
Yeah. I've also, you're reverse engineering the literature machine. You're pulling the panel off and finding how the cogs work.
It's not wrong.
Well, I mean, that's one way of analyzing. That's perhaps reader response school,
I suppose.
But I personally think that's probably the best school. I don't like a lot of literary theory.
To be fair, I know very little about literary theory, so
well,
I'm just.
Yeah, I don't know. This is another one of those things that I think is probably worth hearing from someone else who would actually give it who would actually be on the side of it, maybe. But I just from an epistemological or methodological or method standpoint, I'm trying to draw a fine line there between method and methodological. But it seems to me that if you come to a text with a predisposition based on a theory that you decided to use to read a text, it's like, well, that's bias.
Right.
There's a word for that, and the word is bias. Now, the theories are more complicated than that, right? They're kind of, some of the theories have to do with like, well, what basically is a text, right? And then depending on what you consider a text to be, then yes, you're going to analyze that thing differently. But at least in that sense, you have, I guess, a sort of justification for it. I don't like, for example, Marxist readings of texts, because if something is going to speak, if there's going to be something in the text, well, first of all, if there's going to be something in the text that speaks to the kinds of patterns that a Marxist reading would provide, then those things will probably pop out in the reading, or should. The other reason I don't like Marxists in particular is because, I don't know, it just seems like if you're going to base your literary theory upon a debunked worldview about like economics and people that like killed lots of people, I mean, isn't there something fundamentally wrong about that? And doesn't that mean that there might be, and not like in the same like.
See, the historian in me is keeping his mouth shut right now.
Wait, on what's? Do you have something? I don't think you have something to disagree with me on that. What do you?
Oh, ideologically, I don't disagree.
Okay.
In terms of the pattern of thought, first of all, Marxist theory is still very much alive.
Yeah.
And so it's calling it debunked is probably, I would disagree with calling it debunked from the standpoint of, there are still plenty of people who subscribe to this. I tend to think it's reductive. It makes some very good points about, like, again, sort of the kinds of data you should look for and all of that. But ultimately, I do think that it's biased in a way that's unproductive. In terms of the debunked worldview and killing lots of people, you can make arguments that what did that in, for instance, Soviet Russia is not pure Marxism. Again, that's getting into really hazy stuff about what is Marxism and what were they doing there and all of that. So that's all I meant was, it's there's a significant complication and complexedness to all of that. But
so since I got us into these weeds, I'll try to pull us back up out of this. So
sorry.
No, you make a good point, but I was talking about literary theory, and my point was that I don't like the idea of bringing a purposeful reading to a text that the text does not itself speak to you already.
Yes.
That seems to me to be the equivalent of listening to a person with an agenda, almost, and almost deliberately misinterpreting what they're saying. Now, again, if you take perhaps post-structuralist, this is where I'm at in my wit's end. If you take the idea that if you take the basic idea of the death of the author, then it suddenly makes sense to be able, then it is not, as I guess George Thomas Hansel would say, an act of communication from the past. It's more a thing that carries signs that can be interpreted, and one literary theory is just the same as any other literary theory, in being a lens that you take to the text as something that you can interpret. And there's certainly good work to be done in that area. But
I mean, what's interesting about that is that the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Both can coexist at the same time, doing different things. I mean,
also Hansel, for what it's worth, I should not. Yeah.
What was that?
Oh, Hansel also, the guy I was quoting.
Right.
George Thomas, he's a textual historian, and he makes that point too. It's like, look, you can talk, it can be both of these things. Like, you don't have to shunt one or the other side.
Right.
We were supposed to be helping first year writers, weren't we?
I
think we did.
I plead the fifth.
I think you get to plead, I'm not the guy with the list of questions.
Well, I get to plead I'm not the guy with the students. But I mean, one thing I think could be very productive for your students, and I don't know if, I'm sure you've thought about it and possibly even done it in the past, is, as useful as it may be for us to sit here talking about it, you could pair them off and have them debate each other about it,
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'd love to do. And I've not found a good way to put it, because it's just such a busy schedule.
That's fair.
And one of the things that's really made it hard is that, so we're on a 3-day-a-week schedule, but only 2 of those days are actually synchronous classes. The other one is asynchronous, so it's essentially a deadline, really. They have there's certain work that's due on Sunday, and then I get to see them for a 50-minute period on Tuesday and a 50-minute period on Thursday. Most of the classes are Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I'm in a weird slot that puts me on Sunday. But it's surprising to me how much less I am able to get through in a week having only 2 synchronous days as opposed to 3. Even the asynchronous day does not accomplish as much. It doesn't.
I'm not surprised.
So, I mean, even if I have them doing like the same amount of work, even if I have a recorded lecture for them to watch, it's not, there's not as much flexibility, because flexibility makes progress quickly.
Well, there's also the simple aspect of feedback itself is important to the learning process. And if it's not immediate, then productivity is naturally going to suffer. But
yeah. So I don't know. I mean, I was kind of thinking capping these off at about an hour, unless you have something you really want to talk about or consider further.
not particularly. I mean, the only real advice, well, 2 pieces of advice I would just give to any first-year student, irrespective of what you're studying.
Yeah.
One, like we mentioned, always recognize your own biases and recognize your own hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is perfectly fine. Everyone's hypocritical from time to time. The only way that it becomes negative is when you can't recognize it and then step over it to accomplish your goal. It's part of being human, and all too often especially when you're, young in school and, supposed to be learning to be knowledgeable in all these things, you have this idea that you're supposed to know the answers and that the answers are supposed to be consistent with your opinions. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't. And that's okay. It's important to recognize that in yourself and in others, and to accept it in yourself and in others. And then the only other thing I would say is, ultimately, at an undergraduate level, whether you're studying biology, computer science, English, history, any of it, there's one skill that is going to transcend all of them, and it's that ability to think tightly and in formal, logical senses. Like, we've driven at it again and again while we were talking about this today, but I took on programming after studying history, and I cannot even begin to tell you the amount of overlap between writing a history paper and writing a program, whether it's for a game or like anything. It's just, they're eerily similar.
Yeah. I mean, not to drag on a whole other conversation, but one of the sort of pockets of research in composition studies that's been going for the last 5 years, and I learned about this when I was studying to write my thesis, is transfer literature. And it's basically exactly what you just described, which is the lifting of the lifting of knowledge from one context and an application to another. And I think that it certainly made me a better thinker, because I recognize the sort of deep patterns a bit better. And I'm not saying I recognize them very perfectly, but like you said, at the end of the day, no matter what you go into, you have to make your thoughts make sense, right? It has to add up, right? You don't just get to throw things at the wall and then not even pay attention to whether or not it sticks. That kind of applies to life, I suppose.
Yep.
Something, and they all lived happily ever after, huh?
I'm getting in a pumpkin and going home. I don't know what you're talking about.
All right, Cinderella.
I have the hair for it. Anyway.
All right. Well, hey, thanks. First of all, again, Zach Brett, good friend of mine, truly one of the smartest people I've ever met. And again, I say
Thank
that
you very much.
you won't. But yeah, this has been our first little episode, and I'm gonna shut up now because you probably heard us talk for way too long. So, all right.